Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Grassroots Advocacy. Really glad that you're joining us today. If you haven't had the opportunity to see any of the previous episodes of Grassroots Advocacy, please stop by NACA's website and click on the CNA TV icon, and it will take you to our YouTube channel so that you can see all of the different episodes for CNA TV and for NACA. So over the past few episodes, we've talked about advocacy at the local level. We've talked about advocacy at the state level. And in this episode, we're going to talk about advocacy at the federal level. And when we talk about the federal level, this is an opportunity for you as a grassroots advocate to really shape the future not only of your city, your county, and your state, but of the entire nation. And it's really important for us to think about the fact that every citizen's voice counts. So when we look at advocacy at the federal level, I want to talk about two major components. The first is how you persuade people to consider your point of view as it relates to issues that are taking place on the federal level. The second thing, of course, that I want to talk about is the different kinds of activities that you can look at on the federal level that you can participate in as a grassroots advocate. So the first of those two elements is your ability to persuade the folks that you're communicating with on the federal level, your ability to help them understand your point of view and to really personalize your concerns. And there's two pieces that go right along with that. The first of those pieces is your story, your experiences. No other person in the United States of America has exactly the same sets of experiences that you do. And as a consequence, nobody can really argue with the way you feel or the way you see the issues at hand. And so you might think of it in these terms. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that the federal government was considering decreasing funding for Medicaid. And that has the potential to impact the women and men that you care for on a daily basis. So you might say to that elected official that's considering that vote, the vote to decrease Medicaid, you might say to that person, look, you may not realize it, but the men and women that live in the long-term care environment who are beneficiaries of Medicaid are already struggling. They're already struggling to have their basic desires and needs and wants totally fulfilled just because they have a constrained budget. I'll give you a perfect example. I frequently will go to the dollar store and pick up an extra special soap or a cologne or maybe even a special razor for my residents because they can't afford to get those things on their own. Now, if we cut the Medicaid funding, it's going to be even more difficult for them to have those resources at their disposal. And while I'm glad to care for the men and women that I serve, and while I'm glad to do those special things for them because I love them, I expect that the federal government and the state government should share that commitment with me that the men and women that reside in the post-acute and long-term care environment get the very best care they can and have sufficient resources to live a quality of life. So nobody can argue that statement with you. They can't say, well, you didn't go do this or you didn't go do that, because that's your experience. You did that. Now, the second part of that persuasive discussion needs to be built around facts. And being accurate and having the right facts matters. In fact, Oh, I just did a fact, pardon me. Uh, so in reality, if you state inaccurate facts, even though you might have a compelling and persuasive personal story, it has the potential to take away the credibility of your own personal experiences. And so it's really important to get your facts accurate. I'd like to share with you an example of what I mean by that. This past weekend, Senator John Sidney McCain III transitioned from this life into the next. And Senator McCain is somebody that I have admired. I didn't always agree with him, but I always admired him for his service to this country. Over 55 years of service, in fact. And so I had made a post on Facebook, and one of my family members responded back to me with some statements that were not true with regard to Senator McCain. So I reached out to my family member and I said, hey, I'm concerned that you have your facts inaccurate. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, for example, you said that Senator McCain was given the name Hanoi Songbird. And I said, I did a data search and couldn't find a single place where that statement was made between 1969 and or 1968 and 1973, which was the time in which Senator McCain was confined in a prisoner of war camp. And I could not find another note of that until not too awfully long ago, and that story was discredited. So my family member had a valid point of view and had every right to his perspective, but the fact that he cited inaccurate information made his overall point less valid. And so it's really important for us to think about getting it right, taking the time to find the facts. Now, it's a little more complicated today than it has been historically now. And what I mean by that is when I was born in 1963, and even up until the time I was in my late teens, you basically had 4 ways of getting your information. You could get it from ABC, CBS, NBC, or your local newspapers. Today, there are so many media sources that it can easily get confusing. The other thing is that as we have evolved and as we have welcomed in 24-hour news sources, for example, Fox and CNN and MSNBC and Headline News and these different agencies that run 24-hour news cycles, oftentimes to fill in the entire period of time, they will share a lot of opinion. And you know what they say about opinion, right? Opinions are like backsides. Everybody has one. And they're not always desirable. So it's important for us to think about, okay, where can we get our facts from? So there are a couple of recommendations I'd like to make. One recommendation I'd like to make is to go to government websites. For example, if you'd like to know about infection control, I'd encourage you to visit cdc.gov because they are an authoritative website that has to do with disease prevention and control. If you want to know about Medicare funding or Medicaid funding, I'd suggest that you go to cms.gov, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They are an authoritative site as it relates to Medicaid and Medicare funding. They are also an authoritative site as it relates to regulations. If you would like authoritative sites that relate to government, then you can go to senate.gov or house.gov. There are a number of websites that you can go to that are referred to as authoritative. And those sites have an obligation to present you with the facts. I beg your pardon. So as you're developing your message, remember that your voice and your story and your experience has way more power than any story because it's a story you have and it's a real life experience. It's not a data point. Sometimes I get boggled by the data points and I kind of get lost in them because it's hard for me to understand how that data really translates itself to the lives of real human beings like you and I. So your story is more powerful, and that's where you can have the greatest strength. When you take the time to get the facts and to be knowledgeable, you are just strengthening that story that you've already created by your own life experiences. Now, I want to move on to the second piece, the second major topic area for this episode, and that's really to talk about federal advocacy and the different ways you, as a grassroots advocate, can participate. The first item that I'd like to talk about is funding issues. The post-acute and long-term care environment are funded to a very large degree by Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is really for folks who are coming to your center for rehabilitative services with a goal, hopefully, of being able to return to their natural home or a lesser restrictive level of care. For example, an AL. Medicaid is really for those men and women who we care for, who are going to be have an extended stay, and perhaps your center becomes their new home, their new residence. So it's important to understand those funding pieces. Now, those aren't the only two funding pieces. There are folks who have private pay or private insurance. There are also people we have the opportunity to serve who we are serving because of VA contracts or other third-party contracts. But when you think about the fact that nearly 68% of all people who reside in the long-term care setting, the skilled nursing facility, the nursing home, when you acknowledge that 68% of them are Medicaid beneficiaries and have that opportunity to reside with you, you can see how important it is to understand the funding pieces. When I think about funding, especially as it relates to Medicaid, Medicaid is a matching program. The federal government provides dollars, the state provides dollars, and then those dollars are dispersed throughout the state to meet specific needs. When I think about Medicaid, I think about the fact that most organizations are being reimbursed at a much lower rate than it actually costs to deliver care. And that's why folks are having to go out and buy special soaps and colognes and shavers and birthday gifts and things like that our elders would have to do without otherwise. So this coming year, and also perhaps more importantly as we enter 2019, the House and the Senate will take up a discussion of the budget. Now, we were very fortunate that a tax cut was approved last year, and we're starting to see the impact of that on a personal level. There is a flip side to that, and the flip side to that is, because we cut the taxes, that's a smaller budget to work with. You could think of it this way. You go to work and your boss says, you've been earning $10 an hour, but we've had a decrease in funding, and so all we're going to be able to pay you next year is $8 an hour. So you already think to yourself, okay, my goodness, how am I going to change my lifestyle to live on that $8 an hour? And then, just for the sake of discussion, your significant other comes home and says, honey, guess what? I want to buy a Ford pickup truck and it's going to cost us $40,000. So now you're thinking, okay, I'm going from $9 to $8, and my SO wants to spend $40,000 that's not in the budget. How am I going to make that happen? So in how that applies to the funding question on the national level is, in the next 2 budget years, the House and the Senate are going to have to make some tough choices about how they adjust the budget. And it is possible that the House and the Senate will have to look at decreasing funding for Medicaid. And so that might be a time for us to step up and get to our elected officials and say, look, this is not a good idea, and this is why this isn't a good idea, because it's going to impact quality of life and quality of health. So that's a way that we have the ability to interact as grassroots advocate. Another way that we have the ability to interact as grassroots advocates, is when we look at legislation that could be coming up. For example, not too awfully long ago in the grander scheme of things, the House and the Senate got together and put together a Patient's Bill of Rights. That is legislation that became law. And that is something, of course, that we would really want to support, because we want the women and men that we care for to be able to continue to exercise their privileges as American citizens for as long as they possibly can. And so that's some legislation that we could support. Other legislation that we might want to be involved in is if there's a discussion about changing the retirement age from, say, 67 to 70, we may want to participate in that conversation, because we may not believe, or we may believe, just depending upon your point of view, that that's a good thing. But that's an example of where we might get involved in legislation. Another way that we might participate on the national level is when it comes to policy discussions. So what's a policy discussion? A policy discussion could be something built around how we are going to handle elder citizens' rights and protections and things of that nature. And those policies about what constitutes quality, for example. So those are different ways that we could participate in a very general way. In the coming episodes, I'm going to be talking with you about more specific initiatives, but I want to provide you a broad overview. Advocacy is very important. We can think about how important it is in terms of us being able to have our voices heard. We can think about it in terms of how important it is for us to serve as the voice of the women and men that we care for on a daily basis. We can also think about it in terms of how important it is for us to be grassroots advocates as it relates to shaping an understanding and appreciation for the profession of certified nursing assistant and caregivers across the United States. I really am thankful that you've shared your time with me during this episode. I'd like to conclude with this quote from Senator John Sidney McCain III. Our shared values define us more than our differences, and acknowledging those shared values can get us through our challenges today if we have the wisdom to trust them again. We have a lot of shared values, including valuing our nation's frail, elder, and disabled citizens. Let's focus on that as we try to move conversations forward to make sure that they have the quality of life and quality of health that they deserve. Look forward to seeing you all again during our next episode.